So yes, my name is Haitham Tuffaha. I am an NHMRC Fellow and Associate Professor at the Center for the Business and Economics of Health. And thanks for the invitation. And this is a very timely project and evolving field of research that I wanted to share with you this afternoon. To answer the question is about whether or not we can assess value for money of clinical trials. I always like to start with the why. So why we need to do this? We know that health research is important to generate knowledge and to inform decision making, but at the same time, we all know that we have limited resources in terms of personnel, access to patients to participate, as well as budgets. And decisions have to be made about the best way to prioritize research studies. Now, there has been an increasing interest in value of research, and we do this in Australia for any health investment, where we look at the costs and benefits. So there is no reason why we shouldn't do the same assessment to any investment in health research. This has been acknowledged by various stakeholders, but we know that we do have also different perspectives. So consumers may want to see research that help them maybe access new medicines or technologies and improve their health. Researchers may be interested in demonstrating value for money so that they can make a case for a research study, funding a research study or a research proposal. Funders want to make sure that they spend their money wisely and fund worthy clinical trials. Decision makers, and this is interesting, in Australia, and everywhere, they have pressure to adopt new technologies and interventions. And now they are moving from the reject or approve black and white decisions into more flexible approaches to fund new interventions, conditional on collecting evidence. So they might be interested in knowing whether or not it's worthwhile collecting evidence or funding research to help them make informed decisions and provide early access to novel technologies. So what do we mean by value for money, and how we will be assessing this? So when we talk about value, we mean that we need to compare the expected benefits. Those could be health and economic benefits with the cost of conducting a clinical trial. This often has been done retrospectively after the completion of a project, and many of you are aware of existing frameworks such as the payback approach, where we look at the impact of a funded study after its completion. However, there is an increasing interest in assessing value for money prospectively, that is before we fund or conduct a clinical trial. And in assessing value for money, we can follow qualitative or quantitative approaches. Qualitative approaches where we look at the merits of a clinical trial, but quantitative approaches are important if we want to calculate return on investments, or if we want to place monetary value on a clinical trial and compare that to the cost of a clinical trial. This is based on the notion that any clinical trial or medical research will provide the evidence about safety, efficacy, and cost that will be used to inform decision making. So, for example, reimbursement, funding a new device for a new medicine on the PBS. This would translate into policy guidelines and would result in uptake in practice. So this is where we talk about implementation, and that would result in improvement in health and also economic benefits. If we look at the benefits, considering two states, a factual state in which research takes place, so this is when we want to conduct a new clinical trial, and compare the benefit to the benefit from what we have from existing evidence. So that's a counterfactual state in which we don't conduct research. The difference in benefits between the two states, with and without research, is one way to assess value for money. The quantitative approach that I would like to focus on, because this is one of the commonly used ones, it's deeply rooted in decision theory, and it has also guidelines that have been recently published to inform its conduct and reporting, is the value of information or value of research analysis. This approach focuses on two important elements. So it looks at the value of a clinical trial in reducing decision uncertainty. That's the value in informing decision making, because we know when we have uncertainty, when we don't have precise estimates about efficacy and cause, for example, then there is a risk of making wrong decisions, and wrong decisions are costly because we may fund suboptimal interventions and waste our resources on interventions that are not safe or effective. On the other hand, the other element of benefit is a clinical trial may result in changing practice and can enhance the implementation or even the implementation of interventions. So this will result in improving health and economic outcomes. So if we combine those benefits and monetize them, and then compare these with the research cost, then we can calculate return on research investment. So the value of this approach really is in answering a number of questions for decision makers and funders and researchers as well. So one aspect is to know whether or not existing evidence is sufficient to inform decision making to implement a new intervention, or if additional research is worthwhile. Another element is to conduct efficient trials. So we can design clinical trials in an efficient way to maximize return on investment. And if we know which clinical trials would maximize return on investment, then we can prioritize those clinical trials to fund, for example, or to conduct within our organizations. There are a number of measures under this approach that can be used to calculate the value of additional research, also to know which parameters should be the focus of additional research. So that will help us decide on the type of research that we want to undertake. Is it observational or is it clinical trial, etc. One aspect is also looking at the value of sampling. So we can predict the value for money from various sample sizes and follow-up durations of a clinical trial, so that we can design clinical trials to maximize return on investment. And when we know the cost of or the budget of the clinical trial, we compare the costs and the benefits and costs to calculate the net benefit. So this is the return on investment to know if it is worthwhile conducting that clinical trial or not. This approach has been evolving over the past 20 years, and I've put some examples from countries across the world, so mainly in the UK and the US. Picori, from the US, they showed increasing interest in this approach. And as you can see to your right, there are two examples from the NCI and one from the SWOG as a large cancer clinical trial cooperative group applying this approach to prioritize their clinical trials. In Australia, our group have been pioneering this approach over the past 5 or 6 years. We've applied it to a number of projects. One of them was for an NHMRC Center for Research Excellence in nursing, where we've looked at a portfolio of potential projects, advised whether or not we should proceed with these, and if we want to proceed with some of them, how we should design those trials in an efficient way. To give you an example, from what we did in practice. So this study, we conducted this study a few years ago now. It was about a clinical trial looking at the efficacy of negative pressure wound therapy as a device to reduce surgical site infections in women, high-risk women undergoing cesarean section. At that time, the only evidence that was available came from two small studies, one pilot and one small RCT. And we were asked if a new randomized controlled trial of 400 patients in each arm at a budget of $2 million would be value for money. We conducted a cost effectiveness analysis and economic evaluation of this device, and we considered existing evidence. And based on that evidence at that time, the device was potentially cost effective, but there was high uncertainty around those findings. It was only 65% chance that this device is cost effective. With the value of information analysis, we found that additional research is needed, and we quantified that, and we found that the parameter with the highest uncertainty was the relative risk of surgical site infection. So that definitely would be the focus of the clinical trial. We looked at value for money, the value of information for the sample sizes proposed for this trial. So as you can see, on the vertical axis, we have the value of research in dollar terms. And in the horizontal axis, we have the sample sizes. The green curve represents the value for money across those sample sizes. But as you can see, as we increase the sample size, we improve precision and we reduce uncertainty, which means the research will add more value to inform decision making. However, this comes with additional cost because the more patients we recruit, the more cost we will incur. So if you look at the red line representing the cost of the study based on those proposed sample sizes. The difference between the two curves is the net benefit. That's the difference between the benefit and the cost of a study. And as you can see, it is maximized at a sample size of 200 patients in each arm. So 400 patients in each arm still has positive return on investment, but if you want to maximize that, it's 200 patients per arm. That's the optimal trial design. When we calculated the return on investment, it was around 250%. That's 2.5 times. So for each dollar requested from the NHMRC, we will get $2.5 in value. The study, by the way, it was funded by the NHMRC and it's underway. So this approach is an objective approach. It is rigorous. It bridges the gap between decision makers' needs and research planning and funding. And that's important to improve access to new technologies. However, we know that it might be technically demanding. That people who specialize in this field of research, there are not so many people actually, and there are also some technical aspects of doing this. The other important thing is there are other value components beyond just health and economic benefits. We know research can bring additional benefits to patients and other stakeholders, and we shouldn't be making decisions just based on a cost-benefit analysis. To address those limitations, there are ongoing international efforts. So we've formed a group to look at how to progress this approach. There are now, we're working on user-friendly programmable tools, so any researcher can use with certain inputs from their grant applications. They can put these into the tool and they will get the return on investment of their research proposal in no time. The other thing is we are working on promoting the approach. So CBA will be holding a workshop actually about this approach early next year. We've incorporated this approach into new frameworks in Australia. So ACTA, the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, for research, the group for research prioritization has incorporated this approach into its recent guidelines, and you can find a link to those guidelines. And we will continue to work with BBAC and MSAC to help them use this approach to improve access to new medicines and technologies conditional on collecting evidence. So I know I only have 25 minutes, and to allow time for questions, I will just wrap it up here to summarize. Value of information approach is a rigorous prospective method to quantify the value of clinical trials. It is very helpful to inform decision making, optimize trial design, and set research priorities. Further development of this approach would result, hopefully, in the development of practical tools to facilitate its implementation in practice by researchers, funders, and non-specialists. I'll stop here, and I don't know if we are taking questions now or at the end of the seminar, Julie.
It's David here. I think we should take questions now. I thought that was just spectacular. I guess an interesting philosophy, though, is not just the value for money in getting an answer, but also what is the impact of the answer. So I'll give you a hypothetical example. You might have a very valuable, a very cost-effective trial that shows that a person's headache, is reduced by 30 minutes. And you might have another trial that has a lot less sort of cost effectiveness in actually running the trial that might actually show a reduction in mortality in a different condition. So how do you sort of integrate those two, factors in trying to assess the value of research?
Thanks, David. So if I understand your question correctly, are you referring to different outcomes from two different trials and how to compare these?
Yes, so two completely different trials, but just say you were a funder of research. One's going to give you an answer very cheaply, but the impact of that answer is not going to be very great. One's going to be a lot tougher, more expensive, but the potential impact is that it might save lives. How do you weigh up those two sort of conflicting?
Yeah, that's a very excellent question. And in this approach, we are following the same approach that's followed by the government in doing cost-benefit or cost-effectiveness analysis, where we use a common metric, so that's the dollar value, in order to compare across different trials. Now, considering that we have impacts, so different impacts, so this approach looks at not only the cost effectiveness and the uncertainty in the cost effectiveness, but the value for money is reflected in the improvement in implementation. That's the impact in practice. So if one trial is, yes, it is expensive, but its implementation will result in improvement in health, particularly if you are targeting a large population over some period of time. So if you scale up the results, you will find that so the $7 million that I reported in the case study was based on a certain number of thousands of patients who would receive that device over time across Australia. So that will, considering the two elements, the cost effectiveness and the uncertainty there, and the value of implementation. So that's a term that we are also developing, is value of implementation and practice will combinedly lead to the value of research.
Okay, now that's really, really interesting. I've heard people say that, the government should only put money into research that has a mortality outcome that is going to, which that was said by an ICU doctor who, their whole world is live, die. But I think clearly there's value in many other
Yes, and
types
that's
of trials.
absolutely. There are so many factors to prioritize research, as you know, burden of disease, high mortality, morbidity, etc. This approach would combine most of these elements when you look at the cost effectiveness, because we do look at survival and quality of life to calculate the quality adjusted life years. But I need to make it clear that shouldn't be the only factor determining which studies to fund. We have other things that should be considered, including equity and other elements. It's a way to inform decision rather than prescribe what funders should do.
Sorry, I've hogged all the questions. Other questions, please?
Lovely talk there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. I've just had a question in regards to the tool that you're developing. Is there a cost to access that for the researchers? I guess this is a tool that researchers click on, and do they have to pay per
Yes.
study or?
Yes. Thank you for the question. So there are existing tools online. I've provided a link to the group, the international group. I'm the only Australian on this group, and it's Convoy. So if you go to tools, you'll find a range of tools that can be accessed free of charge there. However, those tools, they are not, I won't say ready for the prime time, and may not be fit for purpose for the Australian setting where we do, where our government really likes to see economic evaluations conducted as well. So what we are doing now is we've developed a theoretical framework for that tool. We've got this published, and what we want to do is to program it and test that tool. So it's under development. Hopefully, we'll find the funding to pursue this and to develop it and make it available for all researchers across Australia. But for now, we have the theoretical framework for the tool, the practical tool, and what we need to do is to program it and test it before we can make it available for everyone.
Great, fantastic.